Help support the show by joining the Patreon or becoming a YouTube member. Also, hit that like button and subscribe if you want more Browns-focused content. Hey, what's up, everybody, and welcome to QnA, the show where I take your questions and answer them here in video format. Ton of questions to get into. Let's jump into it. First question comes from Lord of the ACL. I don't know what the hell you're trying to say here, brother. Is this big running back class, or what is your sweet spot to pick a position? Would you go as high as 33rd? It depends, right? It's more dependent on the player that's available and what I feel about that player that's available. Caleb Johnson, to me, feels like somebody that you can draft at 33 and be okay with, right? Some people feel that same way about Omarion Hampton. I have not gotten to watch a ton of Omarion Hampton, so I don't know if I would feel that way too if I were able to get there. There's a lot of prospects, can't get to everybody, but I'm trying. I'm trying to get to everybody, right? So right now, like Caleb Johnson at 33, that would make sense. Maybe you feel strongly about Travion Henderson at 33 because he can catch, he can receive, he can block, right? You see him as a 3-down back, or you see him as somebody who's going to be able to add a different dimension to your room that maybe the next guy that can offer a similar package is like RJ Harvey, who's not as explosive, not as polished as a route runner, and not as good as a blocker as Trey. So there definitely are tiers to the running back. It depends on what you're looking for. Are you looking for a future number one guy? I think you got to go take that guy somewhere in the second round. Maybe you luck out, you get a guy early third. If you're looking for a supplemental piece, we're talking day 3. You're going to be able to get your hands on somebody pretty good. If you're talking about getting somebody to be that third running back in the room, like if you want to keep Jerome Ford, Nick Chubb still you're still leaning on him to be the running back 1 for you for years to come. I don't think that's going to be the case, but I think they're going to have Nick Chubb in the room, but I don't think they're going to rely on him being the workhorse for more than like a couple of seasons here. But let's say you live in a world where you do rely on Nick Chubb to be the workhorse, right? And you're just looking for a running back 3. Well, there's a lot of guys you can find in the 5th, 6th round that I think could fulfill that role at a high level. So it depends on what you're looking for, what your sweet spot's going to be. You just got to identify what it is that the Browns are looking for, and we'll find out more information about that after free agency, right? If they keep Jerome Ford, or if they cut Jerome Ford, they cut Pierre Strong, right? Do they bring back Nick Chubb? If they don't bring back Nick Chubb, the sweet spot shifts to second round, right? You might want to go get a second round pick and get a running back there. But if they do bring back Nick Chubb, then the sweet spot shifts a little bit down the line. So it all depends on what you're looking for. And what else is on the board. If the rest of the board is due besides the running back, then just take the running back, right? So a lot of different things can factor into why the Browns would make a certain decision or what would be the sweet spot for a certain position. Sad says, I'm down with the plan to pass on QB at the top of this draft. I think it makes sense to be patient, think long term. I think the main reason people are set at quarterback no matter what is because they're scared we'll be average at best again next year with no offense. Do you think this fear is warranted? And do you think it's okay for a team to essentially say, this isn't our year, let's get stocked up for the future, love your work? I think that's absolutely okay for a team to say, right? If they look at the quarterback class and say, hey, this ain't the year I want to swing, let's see what happens next year. I think that's a more than valid choice to make. I think that's a choice that has worked out for teams in the past. If you want to look for a recent example, the Houston Texans, right, said no in 2022 after they traded Deshaun Watson on quarterback in a bad quarterback draft, got C.J. Stroud the next year. So I think it's more than okay to pass on quarterback for that reason. And if you want to take a quarterback this year, if the Browns are legitimately in love with Cam Ward and they love him as a prospect, then yeah, they should take him wherever they could take him. But if the Browns are thinking about just drafting a quarterback just to draft the position, if the hope of drafting a quarterback and hitting on that is driving you wanting to do it, then I think it's a bad idea, right? Like I equate this to scratch off tickets. And the reason I equate it to scratch off tickets is because the argument that I hear a lot about quarterback that makes me even more nervous about taking a quarterback than I normally would be, because like drafting a quarterback is always nerve wracking, right? It's not guaranteed even when it's a great prospect to work out. But the thing that makes me more nervous is, again, the motivation for a lot of people seems to be this scratch off card mentality of let's just get a quarterback because we got all this debt and we got all these problems. So if we spend all of our money on scratch offs, maybe one of them scratch offs going to hit. We could buy our way out this debt. That's the reasoning that I'm getting from people who really want to go quarterback. It's never about the individual players themselves as much as it's about, well, man, if we get right at quarterback, that could solve a lot of problems. It could be really convenient for the Cleveland Browns. You should want to draft the quarterback because that's one of the best players in the draft, not because the ideal of hitting on that position is attractive. So that's my concern. Why are you drafting a quarterback? Is it because you truly believe in that player? If that's the case, cool. Do what you want. Like I'll say it right here. If Andrew Berry, heart to heart, says to himself, this is one of the best players in this draft, that he has this guy in the top 10 of his board, and he says, hey, I want Cam, I want Shador, they're in the top 5 of my board, do it. But if they're not, and you're justifying making the selection because of the allure of hitting on a quarterback, solving your problems, then you're overrating the ability for the quarterback that you draft to solve that problem. Because back to the question, and I feel like I put it on screen because I did stray far away from this question. But back to the question, right? People are scared or wanting the quarterback in this commenter's mind because they think that they are scared that we'll be an average at best offense or have no offense and be an average at best team. That is a founded fear that the Browns could be an average to below average offense next year. The prospects aren't great. The offensive line isn't amazing. The run game wasn't spectacular. Your wide receiving core is thin, but that's probably the most promising thing you have. But again, you got no quarterback. I don't deny any of that. I think where I disagree with most people is the assumption that drafting a quarterback fixes that problem if that quarterback is not the usual quality of prospect that you would take at that selection. Like just because you take a quarterback at number 2 doesn't make him the same as other quarterbacks you would have taken at 2, right? Like just because you draft him at the same position that Jaden Daniels was selected, don't make him Jaden Daniels. You feel me? And I feel like a lot of people think that if we take a quarterback at 2, we drafting Jaden Daniels. This ain't Jaden Daniels. That's the big concern I have is like, hey, what do we think we're drafting at quarterback versus what we are actually going to turn that card in for? And I don't even think Cam Ward's like a terrible prospect, but I think there is a gap between what usually goes number 2 overall and where Cam Ward is. That's just my opinion. Next question comes from Alexander Thornton, who says, Q, if you were Andrew Berry, you can only take Ward or Sanders. Who are you taking? I prefer Sanders. That's who I prefer. I like how he plays. I think his play style fits 1-to-1. I could see the argument for going Cam Ward. The reason I could see the argument for going to Cam Ward is Cam Ward undoubtedly, of all the quarterbacks in this class, has the highest upside, right? He has the best physical traits of any quarterback in this class because he has the arm strength, he has agility. We'll see what he does on field at the combine, if he does anything on field at the combine. But physical traits, he is the best physical traits guy in this class. You have serious questions about the physical traits of Shador Sanders. Will Howard has good physical measurements, but the arm strength is a massive concern. Jackson Dart's fine physically, but he's not spectacular in one specific area in the way that Cam Ward is spectacular with his arm talent. The highest ceiling in this class, or like you could throw Jalen Milroe in there, but I don't think Jalen Milroe's ceiling is as high as people think it is. I think Jalen Milroe's ceiling at quarterback at least is around Tyrod Taylor, like peak Tyrod Taylor. I think that's what the best of Jalen Milroe would look like. So yeah, I think by far Cam Ward has the highest ceiling, and the Browns might be in the business of drafting the highest ceiling at quarterback versus what projects to be the best fit for them. Next question comes from Matt, who says, what do you think of Tyler Shough? He hasn't gotten a lot of analysts from the Cleveland media, but since Greg Cosell podcast, where he ranked him second best quarterback in the draft, I'd like to know more. Love your channel, Q. Tyler Shaw's interesting. The problem with Tyler is that he's super old. He's like 26 right now. So he's an old prospect. We know the Browns generally don't have interest in older prospects. It's been a long-lasting trend for them. I would imagine that would also carry for the quarterback position. The other thing with Tyler that I find interesting, well, not interesting, but like with Greg Cosell liking him. And Greg Cosell is really great, but Greg is a film guy, right? So Greg's going to look at the film, and he don't care about nothing else. And if you look at Tyler Shaw's film, you can see why Tyler Shough was at one point. I think he was a 5-star recruit. But if you're trying to project Tyler Shough, his age and all of that, you factor that in. I think that's why you're not hearing much about him in Cleveland media because, he's a bit old as a prospect, and he's had a giant injury history as well. There's a lot to be concerned about with Tyler Shough and why Tyler Shaw's a name we've only really heard of in the draft process and not necessarily when we were watching college football. Gleazy Baby says, had this conversation with my brother. I believe we can create great conversation on this topic. In regards to drafting a QB, do you align with the theory below that drafting a QB and complementing offensive pieces in the same draft to be beneficial? Is there power in having them go through the ups and downs together? B theory, draft your line skill guys, bring in a rookie into the room with more experience, but ultimately sophomore or year 3 guys to help aid the rookie quarterback. Do you believe one side is more beneficial to the quarterback's development? I would prefer for quarterback's development that you have it already built, because what you run the risk of if you try to build it at the same time that you're drafting the quarterback is that you miss on key pieces, right? Like, let's say you're trying to build an offensive line and draft the quarterback all in the same draft, but you do decent with the quarterback, but do really bad with the offensive line. We saw this with Andrew Luck. You then open that quarterback to having to play with a garbage offensive line for a very long time. I would rather get to a place where I feel really good about the fundamentals that I'm throwing my quarterback out there, right? I don't need an overpowered wide receiver room to draft a rookie quarterback, but what I do need is relative confidence in my offensive line, right? I need that offensive line to be solid, at the very least. I don't want to throw my rookie quarterback into a monsoon of pressure in the NFL, because if there's one thing that does ruin quarterbacks and creates bad habits that these quarterbacks can't shake, is throwing them behind bad offensive lines. So I would want to make sure the line's good, and maybe a veteran tight end to make their lives a little bit easier, and a veteran wide receiver. But yeah, I prefer to have certain things built before you bring in the quarterback, right? Because you can ruin a quarterback so quickly without an offensive line, and I don't want to play any games. I want to know when I draft that quarterback, the offensive line is okay, right? And that way you know if it's your offensive line that stinks or the quarterback that's creating pressure, because sometimes that happens too. You draft the line, you draft the quarterback around the same time, and you think the line is garbage because your quarterback's getting sacked a lot, but then you just find out that your quarterback is just really bad at avoiding sacks. This was Deshaun Watson's whole life in Houston, right? Where everybody thought that the Houston offensive line was trash. Turned out that Deshaun was just not good at avoiding pressure, and the Houston offensive line was actually not that far from being good. because we see it now with CJ Stroud. They're fine. They're not amazing, but they're fine. So yeah, that's how I would go about it. I want to have confidence in my offensive line, in my run game, before I go headfirst into a quarterback, unless I think that quarterback is generational, right? Like if it's like a Joe Burrow, I don't give a damn what's on that team. I'm taking Joe Burrow. If it's one of those level prospects, Andrew Luck, like, okay, we're just going to take him, figure out the rest. But even then, you want to have some sense of urgency about that offensive line, because we're watching Trevor Lawrence right now. He was seen as one of those prospects, and people call him a bust routinely because of how he looks in Jacksonville. So, yeah, I think that I would be on the side of B, which is build that offensive line first and the run game, and give your quarterback something to work with. Make getting wins for that quarterback, whether they be win-loss record wins or just like wins in the scheme of the game, where it's like, hey, we got 5 yards here, 10 yards here. Make it easier for your quarterback to build confidence in offensive line and the run game. Do that. Only One Zay says, with the recent report about Myles shutting the door on re-sign talks, what's the next best move? Well, I don't think he was ever going to sign an extension, but I do think he might be open to a new deal, right? Because there are things that Myles Garrett wants that an extension could not give him, right? So the Browns are going to have to meet him in the middle, right? If Myles does not want to sit out a year, and if the Browns don't want to trade him, well, you got to make some kind of compromise. What kind of compromise can you make? Let's create a new deal that keeps me in Cleveland for a year or two, but gives me some flexibility on the back end to have some control over my future. That's probably the best case scenario that Myles can draw out this situation, and the Browns can draw out this situation. What does that mean for Myles? Probably a no trade clause or a no tag clause, so he can hit the market and decide where he wants to go. And if you're asking why would the Browns give up their leverage there, is because they want to be able to have the chance to show him that they can create a contender around him, and ripping up the last 2 years on that contract and then signing him to a 3-year deal or something like that would allow them the chance to demonstrate that to him, where they hope that they figured everything out, and then Myles is not going to want to be traded anymore. He's going to want to be a lifelong Brown. It's messy, but I think that's where we're headed, if I'm being honest with you. We'll see what happens, though. It's a long time between now and the league new year. Mund says, if the Browns did trade back from 2, do you think Genty would be a prime target, or even possibly at 2 if Abdul goes to the Titans? Obviously, second overall for a running back is wild. Yeah. So no, I don't think Genty's on the mind of the Cleveland Browns, if I'm being honest with you. I don't think that's somebody they're going to go after. I would be surprised, pleasantly surprised, if that's who they want to get, because I like Genty a lot as a prospect. But I don't think the Browns are going to be heavily interested in him. I think if they trade back, they're going to go for possibly a tackle, or possibly Shamar Stewart out of Texas A&M, another edge. Yeah, I think they start looking at some of these positions where it's like, hey, where is the need on our roster, and how do we fulfill it, right? So maybe in that area, they look there, but I don't think I don't see a scenario, unless Genty failed at 33, which is not going to happen, where the Browns would be interested in taking Genty at any point in this draft. So, unfortunately, love the player. I just don't see there's a future for him in Cleveland. There would be a future for him in Cleveland. I don't think his future is in Cleveland. That's a better way to state it. Vince says, would you trade back to 6 to accumulate more picks in the top 100? I feel like we need 5-6 picks in the top 100. Sure, but are we going to get that trade? That's the question. I'm not sold that there is this much energy to trade up for a quarterback at 2. So I don't know if you're going to get that kind of an offer to move off of 2. Like, yes, trading back to 6, you can accumulate more top 100 picks. It makes sense on paper. It makes sense when you do it on the mock draft machines. But the problem is, in real life, you got to have somebody agree to make that trade with you. And I don't know who's going to want to make that move. You know, who's going to be the Browns trade partner? Is there going to be somebody who's going to be the Browns trade partner? Does Las Vegas want to give up those assets to trade up to 2? Do they see that big of a difference? I think that part of it is a lot more messy than people give it credit for. And that's why I'm not super confident that the Browns are going to find a trade back. And I don't think we should rely on the Browns being able to find a good trade back. You know, and the only way I would want to do a trade back is if it's significant, right? So there's that to think about. All right. Quentin Gray says this. So far, everybody's talking about quarterback or edge, but not a lot of talk about the other needs like cornerback, left tackle, wide receiver 2. Which players in this draft or free agency do you see the Browns getting to fill those spots, specifically left tackle? Well, if the Browns do trade back, then I do think left tackle becomes on the board. There's nobody you would want to take at left tackle at 2, but if you trade back to like out the top 10, then Josh Simmons becomes a very viable answer there, depending on how you feel about Kelvin Banks, who I've not heard much about in the pre-draft process. But Kelvin Banks could be somebody you consider a tackle. You know, there's Josh Connerly at the top of the second round. If you're looking at wide receiver 2, Elick Ayomanor is a guy I really liked watching while he was in college at Stanford. He's most known for tearing up Travis Hunter against him in Colorado when he was in the Pac-12. Had horrible quarterback play in Stanford, but I think he's a really good wide receiver. Reminds me a lot of what Amari Cooper used to do for this team. Cornerback is just not as deep as other classes. I like Kobe Bryant. He's somebody who could be available in the 3rd round. So there are guys that you can get to fulfill the other needs later in the draft, right? And it depends on where the Browns are picking at the top of the draft. That will kind of determine how they feel about. Next question comes from Wulahi, who says, if they sign a veteran or trade for a candidate you've talked about, does this eliminate the Browns from drafting? No, I don't think it. Again, it depends on if this front office legitimately loves a prospect, right? And if they legitimately love a prospect at quarterback, right? If they're willing to put their names on it and say, we're drafting this dude because we think he's one of the best players in this class, cool. Take the quarterback, right? But I don't think anything they do in free agency is going to stop them if they really wanted a quarterback, right? Because what you're doing in free agency is to address the short-term need, which is we need somebody to start September. That's what they're doing in free agency. They need to get somebody who can start in September. You can get Jacoby Brissett to do that. You can get Kirk Cousins to do that. Drafting somebody at 2 or drafting somebody later on is a hope to solve this problem in the future. But that's where you're at, right? Long-term, short-term, the getting a quarterback in free agency does nothing to stop you from trying to solve this problem long-term. Now, if they do offer a giant contract to Sam Darnold, well, then that's different. Right, because you see Sam Darnold as your long-term future at quarterback. But I don't anticipate the Browns doing that. So outside of something like that, not much in free agency is going to change what the Browns are going to do. All right, but that's it for Q&A. Y'all have a great day. Have an even better night. Peace.